Hi, I'm Dr. Annalise Bloom. To mitigate the impacts of extreme events such as flooding, we need to understand what is causing trends in extreme events. In this presentation, I'll be discussing some of my research on the causal effect of urbanization on floods, and more specifically, how much an increase in urbanization causes changes in floods. First, I'll go through an introduction to the challenge and talk about how urbanization impacts flooding. Next, I'll talk about the methods we use to estimate the causal effect of urbanization on flooding. I'll present our findings of our research and finally conclude with some ideas on policy implications of how to address these challenges. Moving on to the introduction. Following recent extreme flooding in heavily urbanized places like Houston, Texas, there's been renewed attention on the potential of paved or impervious surfaces in exacerbating flooding events. So the picture on the left is from a Washington Post story about Houston's rapid growth and urbanization. Houston is the largest US city to have no zoning laws, which has contributed to a huge increase in urbanization, and along with it, impervious surfaces, which have been linked to increased flooding, such as during Hurricane Harvey. Smaller cities like Ellicott City, the image on the right, which is near Baltimore in Maryland, have also experienced extreme flooding linked to exacerbations by increases in paved surfaces. So why does this happen? Let's look first at a natural system that hasn't been urbanized. So in this sort of system shown in the image, when it rains, a small fraction of the water runs off of the land cover. Most of the water infiltrates into the ground or evaporates off of that natural surface. But in an urbanized setting, like in the one on the right here, the land surface is covered in impervious surfaces that don't allow water to pass through them. So much more of the water runs off of those impervious surfaces. It runs off into sewers and it ends up in rivers and contributes to much higher flood flows. This is a concern as urbanization increases across the United States. This figure is from a study looking at urbanization, and the authors estimated urbanization increased by 11% from 2001 to 2011 in the United States. The map highlights in yellow and red the places where there have been increases in impervious surfaces over that time period, and the red spots highlighting the largest increases. So we can kind of see it's what we would expect. The places that have had increases in impervious surfaces are big urban areas. Those are also places with the largest populations where people are likely to be impacted by changes in floods. If we look specifically at Puerto Rico, we also see a lot of urbanized areas. Urban land cover in Puerto Rico, shown here from this 2007 study, is shown in the red, and it makes up 11% of the total area of Puerto Rico. Despite a consensus across scientists that human activities are changing floods around the world, it's really difficult to isolate and quantify the causes of these changes. In fact, some previous studies looking specifically at the impacts of urbanization on floods found no effect, while other studies found huge increases in floods by as much as a factor of 10. And these differences are likely due to the fact that it's really complicated to isolate this one effect. There are so many different factors impacting floods beyond urbanization, and these things are happening at the same time. And so what we call confounding factors, they can mask or mimic the effect of impervious surface on floods. So for example, many places where there's changes to urbanization, there's also changes to precipitation, potentially temperature, irrigation, and agricultural practices. There might be changes in how much water is let through due to upstream dams. Humans are withdrawing water in many rivers. There's pumping of groundwater. So given these many factors that are all impacting flood flows, it's not that surprising that previous studies have found such wildly different estimates of the impact of impervious cover on floods. So these challenges lead us to our research question: what is the percent change in annual flood magnitude caused by a 1% increase in impervious cover on average? And so we're interested here in an average effect because we know we're not going to be able to do studies of every specific location where we care about what we think the change in impervious cover might have on floods. And with an average effect, we get this order of magnitude estimate or ballpark estimate to give us a sense of what the impact might be in a wide range of places of urbanization on flooding. To answer this important question, we needed to bridge the disciplines of hydrology, study of water, and economics. As humans have increasingly impacted water resources, we hydrologists, that's what I've been trained in, can benefit from the methods which have been developed by economists who have long been studying how humans behave. So our first step was to map out annual maximum stream flow, our measure of floods that we're looking at across the US. And each dot on this map shows a US Geological Survey stream gauge, and we looked at over 2,000 of them. The larger dots with a black circle around them indicate places where there was a greater than 1 percentage point change in impervious cover from 1974 to 2012. Red dots indicate stream gauges where there was a statistically significant negative trend, so decreasing floods over this time period. And blue dots indicate a statistically significant positive trend, so floods have increased over time. So it may seem counterintuitive at first, but remember how we talked about all of the other factors impacting floods, like dams and changes in rainfall. And so we aren't isolating out just the effect of urbanization on floods. So to try to do this, we came up with a causal graph or causal diagram. And this is just a very simple version. What we have here on the left is a box showing impervious surface. This is considered the shock to the system, what's changing. Impervious cover causes changes to infiltration rate, like we talked about, how much water filters down into the land surface. Infiltration rate in turn is related to how much water runs off, surface runoff magnitude, because if less water infiltrates, more of it runs off. It has to go somewhere. More of the water running off then impacts flood magnitude, which is shown in the blue box. And so we looked at a metric of floods, annual floods, and that's the largest flow in a river in a year because it's the most common measure of flooding and often a really important value to understand for being able to predict floods that might be less frequent but are larger and even more dangerous and damaging than annual floods. As I mentioned before, we have to be careful of these confounding factors. Here we add confounders to our causal diagram, and these are things that plausibly affect both impervious cover as well as annual flood magnitude, and include surface and groundwater diversions or withdrawals or upstream regulations at dams. And the key to getting a good estimate of the effect of impervious cover on flood magnitudes is to be able to control for these confounding variables. And we can do this using statistical models, but a first step is identifying that there are confounders and thinking about how we can then control for them. Finally, there are other predictors of annual flood magnitude, so variables that impact how big floods are, but aren't considered confounding variables in this relationship because they don't plausibly affect impervious cover. So these are shown in orange on the right here and include peak or maximum precipitation, which we would expect to impact flood magnitude, but not plausibly change impervious covers. Others include changes to temperature and agricultural practices. Finally, here's the statistical model we use to estimate the causal effect of impervious cover on flood flows. And don't worry about trying to understand all of this. I just show it here. In case you're interested in learning more, you can read our paper, Bloom, Ferraro, Archfield, and Ryberg in Geophysical Research Letters we published in 2020, and it has many of the details. The summary of what we did is we adapted a modeling approach from economics that takes advantage of the fact that we have data both in time, so we have annual maximum stream flow for each of these gauges, and in space for many gauges across the United States. And having data in both of those dimensions allows us to isolate just the effect of impervious cover on floods and control for those confounding variables that we've talked about. We have to assume that there are no unobserved time-varying sub-regional variables that systematically affect changes to both impervious cover and flooding. Moving on to what we found using the statistical model. So just to remind us, the original question, what is the percent change in annual flood magnitude caused by a 1 percentage point increase in impervious cover? We find that there's between a 2 to 5 increase in annual flood magnitude caused on average by a 1 percentage point increase in impervious cover. This estimate comes from 39 years of data at 280 US Geological Survey stream gauges across the United States. Here we plot this estimated effect that we found of 3.3% increase in annual flood magnitude on average caused by a 1 percentage point increase in impervious cover with the black line. However, there's always uncertainty when you use a model to estimate anything. And so to represent our uncertainty in this estimate, we calculate the 95% confidence interval, which means that there's a 95% likelihood that the true value we're looking for is within the range. And that's why I said our finding is 2 to 5%, because this is our 95% confidence interval that the impact of a 1 percentage point increase in impervious cover that it causes between a 2 to 5% increase in annual flood flows. And while this is somewhat wide, it's actually much narrower than previous studies' findings. So here I've added blue and green points and dashed lines representing findings from previous studies to provide context for our results. These two studies are the only ones that we were able to find of the whole United States that estimated both the effect of impervious cover on floods and reported their data so that we could plot it. The blue points on the top represent the findings of Hollis from 1975. This is the seminal study in this field. And what he found was very large but widely varying effects of impervious cover urbanization on floods. The estimated best fit of the points that were provided by the study are shown with the dashed blue line. In contrast, a more recent study by Salavati et al. In 2016 found much smaller effects of impervious cover on floods, and they used two different methods. So there's a light and a green. There's light and dark green lines and points, but similar findings for both of the methods that they applied. And likely a reason for these very divergent and conflicting previous findings is that these studies weren't successfully able to control for the confounding effects of all of these other simultaneous changes to floods, like we talked about, potentially changes in precipitation, dams upstream, things like that. And while these studies were the two best comparisons that we could find, they don't provide an exact comparison, and you can see our paper for more details. So moving along to conclusions. To predict and prepare for future floods, we need to understand how much these changes are impacting floods. Despite a shared understanding that impervious cover increases flood flows, quantifying this effect has proven to be really challenging. And research over the past half century hasn't been able to come to a consensus about this important question. So using a broad range of river basins across the US, 280 to estimate our effect, and a design that we borrowed from econometrics that better is able to control for these complicated confounding factors, we find that a 1 percentage point increase in impervious cover in a basin increases annual flood magnitude by 3.3% on average, or between 2 and 5%. This work, it really represents only a first step. We were looking at the annual maximum flood flows, but to understand how urbanization impacts a broader range of flooding, we also need to understand how it impacts these less frequent but more extreme and more damaging large floods. We hope that the approach that we present here and in our paper can be extended to help us understand other drivers of environmental change. And also hope this work illustrates to all of you the benefits of collaboration between natural and social scientists here, hydrologists, and economists. Finally, we also need more involvement of non-scientists, and citizen science is a way to help us scientists identify and address many of these pressing questions. So if you're interested in contributing to scientific studies but aren't a scientist, you can look up citizen science opportunities in your area. And if you're interested in learning more about this work specifically, I direct you to our paper that I mentioned in Geophysical Research Letters. It's freely available for anyone for download on the internet. I couldn't have done this work without my co-authors, Paul Ferraro, Stacy Archfield, and Karen Ryberg. I'm really grateful to funding from the PIM postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins University that supported me while I was doing this work. And finally, here are my references, a list of the studies that I mentioned during this talk. Thanks so much for your interest in this important topic. If you'd like to get in contact with me to learn more, my email address is shown here. Thank you.